The sand was hot despite the early hour. Cassidy took off her sandals, and her toes instantly sank into the warm, soft surface, making her pause for a moment and close her eyes. The gentle murmur of the waves rolled rhythmically, like music she had long known but forgotten how to listen to. Here on this beach where the sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, she felt lonely, but perhaps this was the only form of loneliness she could bear. She adjusted the strap of her light bag, slinging it over her shoulder, and headed towards the spot where a few rare umbrellas had already bloomed into bright spots on the sand. There were few people. This was her solace. She wanted to hide, to dissolve into the noise of the sea, so that no one would ask the questions she had so carefully avoided. Setting up her lounge chair, Cassidy looked out at the ocean. There was a paradox. Her heart yearned for tranquility, but a storm raged within her. Her 20-year marriage had crumbled. And although she told herself it was her choice, with each passing day, this freedom became a heavy burden. She leaned over to her bag, pulling out a book, an old, worn-out novel she reread in moments when reality became unbearable. "Interesting choice," a voice said suddenly, and Cassidy jumped. Before her stood a man, young, much younger than her. His skin was tanned as if he spent most of his time under the sun, and his wet hair from the ocean water clung to his forehead. A massive professional camera hung on his shoulder, carried with such ease as if it were just a toy. "Excuse me," Cassidy frowned, trying to understand if he was talking to her. "I said interesting choice," he repeated, pointing to the book in her hands. "You don't often see someone reading Haggard on the beach." She blinked, genuinely surprised. No one had mentioned the author of this book in years. "Yes, it's just an old habit," she said, a bit embarrassed. "You know Haggard?" He shrugged, squatting down next to her lounge chair. "I'd be lying if I said I'd read all his books, but I know a couple. Are you reading him for the adventure or the nostalgia?" Cassidy didn't know what to say. There was something about his easy manner of speaking, his almost shameless smile, that threw her off balance. He looked like he could just take off with the wind, yet here he was, still, as if her answer mattered to him. "I think for both," she finally said, forcing a tight smile. "And you? Are you here for the photos or something else?" "A bit of both," he chuckled, looking at the horizon. "There's something real about this place, you know? This place, this light, it shows things as they are." His words seemed to strike a chord within her. She felt her fingers involuntarily tighten around the book. Something real. She couldn't remember the last time she felt anything so real. "Are you here alone?" she asked to fill the silence. He nodded. "I came here for a few days to do a photo series. Sometimes it's better to be alone when you're trying to capture something important." He looked at her again, his gaze becoming a bit more intent. "And you?" Cassidy felt her throat go dry. "Just relaxing. Some time for myself." He smiled, and it was warmer than she expected. "You know, sometimes it's when we're alone that we start to notice more. I'm Aiden, by the way." "Cassidy," she murmured, feeling her heart quicken. "Nice to meet you, Cassidy." He stood up, easily slinging the camera over his shoulder. "If you don't mind, I'll set up somewhere nearby. I think the light will be amazing today." She just nodded, not knowing what to say. He left, leaving behind a strange feeling, as if she hadn't just met a stranger, but encountered something bigger than she could comprehend. Sitting there, holding her book, Cassidy felt both intrigued and unsettled. Who was this young man? Why did his words make her think about things she had long buried? Her gaze involuntarily slid after him. He was absorbed in his settings, but every now and then, his eyes would look up to meet hers. It wasn't intrusive, not rude, just a look full of interest and something else. Cassidy opened her book again, trying to focus on the pages, but the words no longer held her attention. Inside her, a feeling began to grow, something between curiosity and fear. She didn't know what it meant, but she was sure of one thing. This encounter would change her. The sun's rays began to rise higher, painting the world in warm golden hues. And in Cassidy's head, Aiden's words echoed loudly. "Sometimes it's when we're alone that we start to notice more." Aiden sat up nearby, but his presence felt closer than she expected. Cassidy saw how he concentratedly adjusted his camera, taking a few shots of the horizon, then the sand, and then, fleetingly, of her. His movements were smooth as if he had long studied the language of light and shadow. She tried not to look, immersed in her book, but every time she turned a page, she caught herself wondering where his lens was pointed. When she finally allowed herself to look up, Aiden was already standing nearby, his shadow cast on the sand, creating a strange contrast with the bright sun rays. "Can I show you something?" he asked, lifting his camera. Cassidy was taken aback. She looked at him in surprise, not knowing what to answer. He didn't wait for permission. He just sat down on the sand next to her lounge chair and held out the camera. "Look," he said, his voice low but gentle, almost soothing. On the camera screen was her face. She didn't remember him taking her picture, but there she was, thoughtful, with a book in her hands and the sun enveloping her in a soft golden light. In her eyes, it seemed, there was a depth she had long lost. She hesitated, astonished. "I don't look like that." "That's exactly how you look," he said confidently. "Sometimes we see ourselves wrong. The camera doesn't lie." Cassidy lowered her gaze, feeling her cheeks flush. It was unexpectedly intimate, seeing herself like that through someone else's eyes. "Why did you do that?" she asked softly. Aiden smiled and shrugged. "I'm a photographer. It's my job to find beauty in the simple. But in your case," he paused and his eyes met hers. "It was easy." She felt something strange and uncomfortable stir in her chest. She wanted to reject his words, to brush them off, but there was something so sincere in them that she couldn't. "You see the world so differently, don't you?" she finally said, trying to steer the conversation to safer ground. Aiden hummed and nodded. "I think so. For me, it's all in the details. Seeing how the sun's rays glide over the water, how the shadows change on the sand, or how someone reads a book, lost in their thoughts." His words made her feel strangely vulnerable. She looked down at her book again, but her fingers trembled and the text no longer made sense. "It's hard," he continued. "Most people walk past such things. I don't blame them for it, but sometimes it makes me feel like an outsider." She looked at him then with new interest. His face, tanned and calm, suddenly seemed younger than she thought. In his words, there was something she knew, a feeling of not fitting in, of seeing something others didn't notice. "I think I understand," she said softly. "I sometimes feel like an outsider too." Aiden looked at her intently, as if trying to gauge the truth of her words. "You?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "Why?" She hesitated, but then decided to be honest. "I spent so much time trying to meet expectations. Being a good wife, mother, employee, and then you suddenly realize you don't know who you are without all those roles." Her voice trembled, but she continued. "And when it all disappears, you're left with a void you don't know what to do with." Aiden didn't look away, his expression serious but gentle. "Maybe the void isn't so bad," he said. "It's space to start something new, space to be yourself." Cassidy smiled bitterly. "It sounds so simple." "It's never simple," he said, "but it's worth it." For a moment, silence hung between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was a silence in which both were contemplating what had just been said. "Let me show you something," Aiden suddenly said, standing up. "Come on." Cassidy looked at him in surprise. "Where?" "Just over here," he said, pointing to the far end of the beach where cliffs towered over the shore. "There's a spot I found. I think you'll like it." Her first thought was to refuse, but something in his voice, his confidence, his kindness, made her stand up. "Okay," she said, trying not to show how much her hands were shaking. As they walked along the shore, his steps were light but determined, and hers were cautious, as if each step brought her closer to something unknown. Cassidy and Aiden reached the edge of the beach, where dark cliffs loomed over the waves like sentinel bastions. Here, away from prying eyes, the ocean sounded louder, and the wind was sharper. Cassidy paused for a moment to take it all in, feeling the cool mist of salty spray on her skin. "This is the spot," Aiden said, stopping at a rocky outcrop. He lifted his camera and took a few shots of the horizon, then turned to her. "See? There's a different energy here." She silently nodded, unable to express the strange feeling this corner of nature evoked. Here, everything was different from the rest of the beach. Fewer people, more ruggedness, more movement. Waves crashed against the rocks with a thunderous roar, leaving a thin layer of foam that disappeared almost instantly. "It's like time has stopped here," she finally said, looking at the lines of the cliffs that seemed carved by eternity itself. "Exactly," Aiden agreed. He turned to her, his voice softening. "It reminds me that we're also little pieces of time. Sometimes it helps, you know? When you feel lost or out of place." Those words, so simple, hit the mark. Cassidy looked at him, feeling something stir within her. She knew what he was talking about, even if she wasn't ready to admit it aloud. She had felt out of place for a long time. Too old for dreams, too invisible for the world. "Do you always think like this?" she asked, trying to hide her inner vulnerability behind a question. Aiden smiled lightly, almost forgivingly. "Not always. Sometimes I get confused too. But the camera helps. Through it, everything seems clearer." He lifted it again and pointed it at Cassidy. She froze. "What are you doing?" she asked, suddenly aware of every wrinkle, every soft line of her body. "Just looking," he replied calmly. "The camera helps me see people as they are. And you're strong, you know?" She looked away, shaking her head. "Me? Strong? I don't think so." "You're here," he said, lowering the camera. "You choose to move forward, even if you're not sure it's right. That's strength." Those words made her think. She tried to understand if she believed him. She wanted to believe, but her mind immediately built walls of doubt. "People usually don't see it that way," she said quietly, turning to the ocean. "When you get older, they start to perceive you differently, as if you no longer have the right to desires, to dreams." Aiden moved closer, his warm voice cutting through the noise of the waves. "And what if I tell you that's not true? That all of this is just rules made up by others? Why should we obey them?" Cassidy looked at him, and her eyes met his. She saw in them something that made her heart beat faster. It was not just sincere admiration, but also a challenge to her doubts, her fears. "Aiden, you're younger than me," she finally said, her voice soft but firm. "Much younger. Don't you feel that this is strange? That this is wrong?" He frowned, but not out of irritation, out of serious contemplation. "I don't think it's strange. I think it's rare. You know, to meet someone who understands you, who speaks the same language. It's not always about age, is it?" She felt the words catch in her throat. He spoke with such confidence, such calm, that it was almost impossible to reject. But her mind kept returning to the same thought. What would others say? How would this look? "You don't understand," she finally said. "People will judge. They'll think I don't know, that I've lost control, that I'm desperate." Aiden took a step closer, his eyes full of warmth. "And what do you think? What do you feel?" That question hit her like a bolt of lightning. She realized that her thoughts had always revolved around what others would think. She had never asked herself what she wanted. She faltered, feeling her voice tremble. "I don't know." Aiden smiled gently without pressure. "Then maybe it's time to find out." The silence that followed his words was deep. They stood at the edge of the cliffs, next to the endless ocean that crashed against the shore again and again. Cassidy felt something new rising within her, a mix of fear and hope. She didn't yet know what to do with it, but one thing was clear. Aiden was right. Maybe she deserved more than she allowed herself to think. Night enveloped the beach in its velvety cloak, absorbing the sounds of the day and turning everything into a world of shadows and whispers. Only distant stars in the silver moonlight illuminated their path. Cassidy followed Aiden along the shore, feeling the soft sand cool her bare feet. It was a strange sensation, both comforting and frightening, as if she were walking on the edge between two worlds. "Careful, it's a bit slippery here," Aiden warned, steadying her by the elbow as they crossed wet rocks. His touch was light, but she still felt her heart skip a beat. She wanted to say something to fill the silence, but words seemed out of place. Instead, she focused on the sounds, the whisper of the waves, the rustle of the wind, their steps softly rolling over the sand. They stopped at a small, hidden cove, sheltered from the world by high cliffs. Here the ocean seemed even closer, its breath powerful and confident. Aiden set up his camera on a tripod, then sat right on the sand, gesturing for her to join him. "I want to show you something," he said, his voice deeper and softer in the night silence. Cassidy sat down next to him, crossing her legs. Her hands automatically found their way to the sand, running her fingers over its cool surface. Aiden pressed a button on the camera, and the screen lit up with a soft light. On it were stars, but not as she saw them with her own eyes. They shone brighter, connecting in incredible patterns, as if the screen held an entire universe. "This is amazing," she whispered. Aiden smiled, looking not at the screen but at her. "You only see what I can capture through the lens. In reality, they're even brighter." Cassidy turned to him, feeling a sudden surge of curiosity. "Why do you photograph? What's in it for you?" He pondered for a moment, his gaze drifting to the ocean. "Photography is my way of preserving moments. Everything passes so quickly, but through the lens, I can stop time. Sometimes when you look through a camera, you see more than you can with your eyes. It's like the lens strips away all the layers, leaving only what's most important." His words resonated with her. She too wanted to stop time, to hold on to something she felt slipping away. "I think I understand," she said. "Sometimes it feels like life passes so quickly that you don't get to feel it. You just move along with the inertia." Aiden looked at her, his gaze warm and penetrating. "It's not just about speed, it's about the fact that we often forget to look. We close ourselves off, turn away, because we're afraid to see what's inside us." She felt his words break through her defenses. Everything she had hidden for so long surfaced, her fears, her regrets, her desire to be understood. It was almost unbearable. "You make it sound so easy," she said, her voice a bit louder than a whisper. "But it's not. It's scary." "Of course it's scary," he agreed. "But isn't it worth it?" His gaze was honest, direct. He wasn't trying to convince her. He was simply asking a question she had to answer for herself. She remained silent, her eyes returning to the camera screen. The stars on it seemed closer than reality. "When I was a kid, my mom used to say that stars are our wishes," he suddenly said, his voice soft. "She died when I was 17. But ever since, I look at them and think about how her wish was probably for me to find my place in the world." Cassidy felt her throat tighten. She hadn't expected such openness. Aiden continued, "Sometimes I think about what she would say if she saw who I've become. I'm not sure she would approve of everything I've done, but I know she would want me to be honest with myself. And being honest, that's probably the hardest thing there is." She looked at him, feeling tears well up in her eyes. In this night, in this person, there was something that made her open up in a way she hadn't in years. "My mom used to say that the most important thing is to learn to love yourself," she said softly, "but I never understood what that meant." Aiden turned to her, and she saw in his eyes something more than just understanding. It was recognition. "Maybe it means just allowing yourself to be," he said, "to feel without having to justify it." Those words pierced her. She felt the space between them grow tense, almost palpable. His face was close, his eyes searching for hers, and she realized that her fears, her doubts, suddenly seemed less important. What mattered was what she felt at that moment. When he gently touched her hand, her heart skipped a beat. His fingers were warm, confident. She looked at him, feeling their world shrink to this small cove, to the sound of the waves, to their breaths. "You deserve to be happy, Cassidy," he said softly, and in that moment, she believed him. The next morning, Cassidy returned to the beach, feeling a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Her encounter with Aiden the night before had left her confused. She knew something between them had changed, but she was afraid to admit it even to herself. As she passed a row of beach umbrellas, she noticed a familiar figure. Her old friend Lauren was sitting in a lounge chair, shielding her eyes with large sunglasses. "Cassidy," Lauren waved, her voice surprised. "What are you doing here alone?" Cassidy paused for a second, but then forced herself to smile and walked closer. Lauren, always perfectly put together, looked at her with mild curiosity. "Just decided to relax a bit, Cassidy said, sitting down next to her. She hoped the conversation would stay superficial, but Lauren quickly picked up on her unusual mood. You look different, Lauren noted, taking off her glasses and looking at her intently. Something happened? Cassidy hesitated. She could lie, make up something trivial, but she didn't want to. Her night conversation with Aiden was still fresh in her memory, as were his words about being honest with herself. But how to tell Lauren? Nothing special, she finally answered, trying to sound casual. Just enjoying the quiet. Lauren frowned, clearly not satisfied with that answer. She looked around and her gaze stopped on Aiden, who was standing by the water with his camera. His figure was easily recognizable, even from a distance. And who is that? Lauren asked, squinting. Is he with you? Cassidy felt her heart tighten. She knew Lauren wouldn't miss the chance to pry for details. He's just an acquaintance, Cassidy quickly replied. He's a photographer. Lauren raised an eyebrow. Her face lit up with a mix of curiosity and mild disapproval. A young photographer, she noted. You're spending time with him? Cassidy felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks. She couldn't understand what exactly in Lauren's tone made her feel guilty, but the feeling was unbearable. We were just talking, she said. He's an interesting person. Lauren fell silent for a moment, her gaze becoming more evaluative. Cassidy, you do realize how this looks, right? She finally said. You're an adult woman. He's clearly much younger. People might think, well, you know. Those words hit Cassidy harder than she expected. She knew Lauren didn't mean any harm, but her tone and gaze left no doubt. In those words was what she feared most. Judgment. I don't think anyone has the right to judge, Cassidy finally said, her voice softer than she intended. I'm not doing anything wrong. Lauren smiled, but it was a cold smile. Maybe not, but the world doesn't work that way. You've always been sensible, Cassidy. Just be careful. Those words hung in the air, and Cassidy felt something inside her tear. She couldn't help but think about what Lauren said. Maybe she was right. The world rarely shows kindness to those who step outside its expectations. When Lauren left, Cassidy sat alone looking at the waves. Her thoughts were chaotic. She tried to understand what to do. Aiden didn't fit into the categories she was used to applying to people. He was young but mature, sincere but not pushy. He saw her in a way no one else had, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the world around her would never accept it. Are you okay? Aiden's voice pulled her out of her thoughts. She looked up and saw him standing next to her. His gaze was concerned but warm. Yeah, just lost in thought, she replied, trying to hide her emotions. He sat down next to her on the sand, not asking questions, just being there. It was both a comfort and a reminder of how different he was from everything she knew. I saw you talking to someone, he said, breaking the silence. Was that a friend? She nodded. Yes. We've known each other for a long time. She's just worried about me. Aiden leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. And is she worried about what others might think? His words hit the mark. They perfectly expressed her own thoughts. She looked at him, unable to respond immediately. It's complicated, she finally said. People have their own ideas about what's right and wrong. Aiden nodded, his gaze thoughtful. And what do you think? Not them? Not your friend? You. She remained silent, feeling a surge of emotions. She couldn't give a simple answer because she didn't know. All she knew was that she was drawn to him, despite all her fears. I don't know, she admitted finally, but I want to find out. Aiden smiled, and there was so much warmth in his smile that her heart fluttered. Then maybe we can figure it out together, he said softly. Those words didn't give her a ready solution, but they gave her hope. She didn't know what awaited her, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to take a risk. The sunset painted the beach in warm golden hues, turning the ocean into a shimmering horizon. All day, Cassidy had avoided meeting Aiden. Her conversation with Lauren had lodged in her mind like a thorn, making each of her steps feel heavy. But despite her attempts to stay away, she knew she would return to the spot where they had first found common ground. When she reached the small, secluded part of the beach, Aiden was already there. His silhouette stood out against the dying light, and his camera lay on the sand beside him. He didn't say a word when she approached, just gave a brief nod, as if he knew she would come. Cassidy paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts, then slowly sat down next to him. "I've been thinking about this all day," she said softly, looking at the waves. "About us. About what this means." Aiden turned to her, his face calm but focused. "And what have you decided?" he asked, his voice gentle but deep, like distant thunder. She fell silent, her gaze remaining fixed on the horizon. The waves crashed against the shore with rhythmic certainty, as if reminding her of the inevitability of time. Inside her, a struggle raged. She thought about Lauren, about what her friend had said. She thought about her family, her children, about how they might react. But most of all, she thought about herself. "I can't live based on what others think anymore," she finally said, her voice trembling but firm. "I've hidden behind others' expectations for too long, afraid of being judged. But you know what's truly terrifying? I'm afraid I'll never feel again what I feel when I'm with you." Aiden slowly nodded, his face lighting up with a smile of relief and recognition. "You have no idea how much I wanted to hear that," he said. "But I didn't want to pressure you. I wanted you to come to this on your own." Cassidy felt tears well up in her eyes. It wasn't the pain or doubt that brought them on. It was relief, as if the burden she had carried for years had finally lifted. She looked at Aiden, who now sat closer, his warm hand resting on the sand next to hers. "I'm still afraid," she admitted, "but maybe that's okay. Being brave isn't about not being afraid. It's about living despite the fear, right?" "Exactly," he confirmed, his voice full of certainty. "We all have fears. The question is what we do with them." She silently nodded, their gazes meeting again. In that moment, there was something honestly vulnerable. She looked down at their hands, so close yet not touching, and felt a surge of courage. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against his. He looked at her, his eyes filled with warmth and acceptance. I think I'm ready," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Aiden smiled, his gaze never leaving hers. "Then let's find out together," he said softly. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and orange, Cassidy felt a sense of peace wash over her. The world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of the waves and the gentle touch of their hands. In that moment, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them with Aiden by her side. The sunset cast a warm, golden glow over the beach, turning the world into a canvas of soft hues. Cassidy and Aiden sat side by side, their hands entwined, as the waves gently lapped against the shore. The air was filled with the scent of salt and the distant cries of seagulls, creating a symphony of nature that seemed to embrace them. "You know," Cassidy said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I never thought I'd find something like this again. This feeling of belonging." Aiden turned to her, his eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "Sometimes the most beautiful things come when we least expect them," he replied, his voice gentle yet firm. Cassidy smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She looked out at the ocean, the waves rolling in with a steady rhythm, and felt a sense of calm wash over her. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace with herself and the world around her. I think I'm finally ready to let go of the past and embrace whatever comes next," she said, her voice filled with a newfound determination. Aiden squeezed her hand gently, his touch reassuring and comforting. "And I'll be here with you, every step of the way," he promised, his voice filled with sincerity. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the beach in a soft, ethereal light, Cassidy knew that this moment marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, a chapter filled with hope, love, and the promise of a brighter future. And with Aiden by her side, she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that together they could overcome anything.